In the 1960s, we had a huge famine in India. We had to buy grain from the US, and we realized that, yeah, this is not working out for us. A lot of ink has been spilled about why India and China, despite starting at the same economic levels in 1950s, have not gained the same level of growth in manufacturing. Now, to understand this properly, we need to go back to the history. In the 1950s, India and China were indeed at the same level. They were probably deindustrialized. They did not have the capabilities of other Western manufacturers, and they could not fight on equal terms in the global markets. So, what both countries did was follow this policy of really restricted imports. All the imports from global markets were tariffed heavily by the Nehru government, and the local industry was given precedence. What happened was there were a lot of state owned industries, there was a lot of focus on heavy industries, so a lot of growth happened there. We were producing 6,000 tons of steel by the 1960s, and similar things happened in China. Of course, there was a problem there too, because we almost unilaterally focus on industrialization. We did not focus as much on our agricultural industry. We did not focus as much on children's education. And that kind of turned back on us. In the 1960s, we had a huge famine in India. We had to buy grain from the US, and we realized that, yeah, this is not working out for us. So in the 1970s, there were further regulations placed on people, and what Indira Gandhi did was actually put a lot more restrictions in on large businesses. There was actually a rule that said, like, things like apparels, kitchen appliances, these could not be made by large manufacturers in India. They have to be made by small manufacturers. And for this licensing, because you needed a license to produce everything, you needed to get licenses from the government officials. This created this dreaded license Raj, where the entry barrier to Indian businesses was so high that only a few players could get in. On the other hand, China was suffering from its own problems. In the 1960s, they had a great famine. A lot of growth had just kind of decelerated. But then Deng comes in and he says, look, we are going to allow foreign investments into China. We will have state owned enterprises, obviously, but we'll also allow foreign companies to operate. What this meant that 70s, 80s, 90s, China was aggressively globalizing itself. It was inviting in a lot of foreign investments and also building a manufacturing capability that the world would really like. Global investors really love China because obviously the labor was cheap, there were not as many regulations as the foreign world had, and they could literally build everything. This basically forms the stage for China's global dominance in manufacturing. On the other hand, India had a restrictive government. It also was spending a lot of money in the state owned industries, which was not actually producing anything. One of these egregious examples is a Haldia plant. It was supposed to be a fertilizer plant, and there were 1,500 employees. And the plant ran for 21 years without producing even 1 pound of fertilizer. Just imagine that much wastage. So, what started happening was the inflation in India rose like anything. The people were languishing after promises of growth for 40 plus years. They had not seen that much growth. and the government decided to liberalize the economy. They opened themselves up to trade. By the 90s, India was completely open to trade. Foreign investments were coming in, and the country was finally growing. What happened here was that even though the companies were growing, the local manufacturers could not outcompete the global manufacturers. And even the ones that could outcompete global manufacturers actually started using Chinese imports because the value chain had been kind of ruined by China by then. China basically had a cheaper product with a better quality, and we were struggling again. What had also happened during this time was 90s had seen a lot of people in India, especially the rich, the economically prosperous middle class, become more richer, and they had started buying imported goods because they wanted better quality, and the local manufacturers could not compete. We were undergoing premature deindustrialization without having anything to compensate for it. We had a services industry, yes. India will always have this competitive advantage over China in that, it has more English speaking natives, and it can actually dominate the world in terms of services, communication software, all of these spaces India can dominate in. But the problem was, though there was a promise that the services industry could account for all this joblessness in India and could employ increasing number of people every year, that promise never really materialized. Like services industry does employ a lot of people in India, but it just was not keeping up with the joblessness. And on the other hand, China had great local competition. It did not have that license Raj period. And because the local competition had to edge out each other, they did that through innovation. Remember, they did not have access to the technology that the global markets had. So they innovated with whatever material they had on hand. China also increasingly created refineries, did a lot of processing of rare earth minerals, and started adding themselves to every value chain on earth. Right now, for a laptop, you may create the body in India. We have bauxite mines, we have aluminum, etc. etc. But for the batteries, you need to go to China because they basically control the rare earth minerals that do so. For EVs, for everything else, specialty chemicals and rare earth minerals are virtually controlled by China. China controls almost 90% of the supply for rare earth minerals in the world. So, no matter what you do, your value chain has China in it. And companies don't want to follow this value chain. Like, global investments in China are reducing themselves because companies are realizing that this government is much more stricter on environmental regulations. It has different plans. The IP protection isn't great because if you build in China, these manufacturers obviously get access to the proprietary designs you make and they start flooding the market with similar products. So these manufacturers want to get out from China and go to India. But in India, there's a separate problem. There are a lot of local players, but because there was no liberalization, the entry barrier was so high, there are not that many players who innovated and fought against each other to create a competitive business. We don't really have a huge industry. Right now, we are doing what China did in the 70s. We are inviting in foreign investments, we're asking them to meet companies, and we are hoping that, yeah, maybe someday we'll be able to use this technology to make our own things. And that will be great. But the thing is, in a global market perspective, China is 20 years ahead of us. And That is a result of a lot of political decisions that have happened before and a lot of problems that have come before us. What we need to do now is actually manufacture, and it's difficult to do so. Why do B2C companies exclusively come out of use Chinese manufacturers? Because it's cheaper. And yeah, China labor costs are increasing. India's skilled labor costs are still very low. But we need to actually get to that level of competence that China has and that level of value chain authority that China has, which we don't have really. Our rare earth minerals are not exploited properly. There are a lot of problems. There are things that we cannot do that China does. And our manufacturing sector will suffer because of that. But there's hope there. The policies have been much better in the recent years. A lot of development has happened. There's a lot of incentives tied to industrialization now. And hopefully, by 2050, we will see India emerge as a global leader in manufacturing. I only hope that China won't be the global leader de facto by
मुझे पता है इस देश में कोई छोटे कंटेंट क्रिएटर्स की केयर तो करता नहीं है, पर अगर आपको इंडिया के बारे में और जानना हो और उनकी पॉलिसीज़ के बारे में थोड़ा सा इन डेप्थ न्यूज़ चाहिए हो, तो सर जी भगवान के खातिर थोड़ा सा सब्सक्राइब और लाइक कर दीजिए, बहुत फ़ायदा हो जाएगा मेरा।